do this.
Hello, and welcome to this year's Microsoft in Higher Education Conference 2021. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever your time zone might be. This conference is hosted by the Microsoft in Higher Education listserv and Microsoft Education. We have quite a committee with us. So from the peer side, we've got Brian Arkills from the University of Washington, Philip Erb from University of Scranton, Ross Wilper from Stanford University, specifically SLAC, Phil Swansea from Penn State, Andrew Sanders from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and Billy Bodine from North Carolina State University. From the Microsoft side, we've got myself, Steve Scholes, we got Caden Shearer, Corey Lee, Ken Hoover, and Scott Ellison. First, I want to thank everybody who's been part of the committee putting it together. We've got 25 sessions. It should be a very informative conference this year. It is pretty much an equal mix between Microsoft presentations, peer presentations, and some of them that are a combination mix. First, all sessions will be recorded. For the keynote, we're using Teams Live event, so you can post questions anonymously inside of the Q&A window. For all other sessions, we're going to be using regular Teams meetings. Other participants will be able to see your name and other information, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please disconnect now and watch the recorded session when it's posted to the conference website, which will be via YouTube channel. Session details, while you have registered for the event, you only received an invite for the opening keynote. Please refer to the agenda site for direct links to individual sessions. There is also an ICS, thank you, Philip, available for each session to add to your calendar. We will make this deck and all of the decks available, so you'll be able to get to the links, but it's if you do a search for Microsoft in Higher Education Conference, it's pretty much the first thing that pops up inside of your search bar. You don't have to worry about it for this session because it's Teams Live event, but other sessions, please mute yourself. Post questions throughout the presentation. Moderators will attempt to answer your questions. For those needing, the presenter will be answered at the end of the session. If you wish to ask a question, there will be time at the end of the session for Q&A. Not for this one because it's Teams Live event, but for others, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Surveys and follow-up, so we will have surveys after each session so that we can get some feedback. Please fill it out. If we did great, let us know. If we failed to meet your expectations, let us know so we can get it right next time. Looking for more info, or you would like your account team to reach out to you on a particular subject, send us an email. We'll make sure you get this email address so that you can follow up with that as well. And thank you, and welcome to the session. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela Dingle and Heather Flanagan to kick off our keynote.
All right. I think we have kicked off the keynote.
Yes.
Can you see our slides, and can you see us?
You'll be there in a second, but we can definitely see you.
All right. Let us know when.
Okay, go ahead. You can go.
All right, perfect. Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a great morning. And I hope that this is going to be a fun trip through a little bit of future here for the High Ed Conference. Let's get going. One thing before we start, in case you are here hoping to find out roadmap information about how Microsoft is working on identity, that is not this presentation. We are really talking about industry standards. We are talking about how we're working in standards bodies and trends around the industry, but we're not talking about Microsoft product per se. So we thought we would just level set that in case you have other things you want to do if you really wanted the roadmap presentation. Right, let's get going with introductions. Heather, why don't you start?
Sure. So my name is Heather Flanagan. I'm currently an independent freelancer working in the standards and identity space. And I used to work at Duke University and Stanford University, so I have experience in the R1 field. I have also worked with the organizations that publish RFCs, which sort of define how the internet actually functions. I was the RFC series editor. I'm the publisher for ID Pro, which is a professional organization for identity and access management specialists. I work with REFEDS as co-coordinator. REFEDS is the ARNI Federation consortia of the academic federations around the world. I work with Seamless Access as their technical liaison. That's a project that's focused specifically on the identity discovery components. I'm even spinning up something called the Identity Flash Mob, which is an effort to try and make identity information and standards information consumable to folks like my mom, and maybe to your mom, and maybe to your kids. So lots of different hats, all of which I wanted to bring to you today because Pam and I have thoughts on what we're seeing across the board for the future of identity. Pam.
Well, thank you. Yes, so my name is Pamela Dingle, and I am the Director of Identity Standards for Microsoft. And what that means is that I run a team of 6 people, including myself, who go out to various standards bodies, including the OpenID Foundation, IETF, ISO, the W3C, the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and more. And what we do there is we go to try to negotiate the specifications that run our world, or at least our identity world anyway. And so, my team can sort of see what's happening. We get to see some of the work that's happening in other companies that they've brought to standards bodies, and they also get to see the work that our internal engineers are doing that we think we want to share with the world. So that's that's what I do today. The other thing that I get to do is work with the analyst. So I see a lot of discussions around trends in the industry from the analyst perspective. So all of that makes it a lot of fun to be able to come here and talk about what's happening. Now, what we want to do here is really talk about the education lens, if we can, which is of course why Heather is here. So between the two of us, we should have a pretty rocking conversation. Now, we have Q&A open. We're happy to run the Q&A. If we see fun stuff, we will answer it going through, but otherwise we'll wait to the end and then we can get some rocking Q&A going. All right. So you will have to travel with us to look through the crystal ball at where the identity world will go. And I think before we start, we need to in fact, excuse me, define identity. Identity is not simple, and yet everyone knows what it is. In fact, it's a running joke in the identity community, for those of you who are in it, that if you want to derail any meeting anywhere, all you have to do is ask, but what is identity? And it all just goes off the rails. So, we have personal relationships to our identity. We have personal relationships to our expressions. We also have, for those of us in the IAM world, meaning identity and access management, there's a professional practice which is really about making sure that people get access to the right resources at the right time and in just the right amount. And that whole idea of making sure that someone is productive, but not able to abuse, and to make sure that things are safe for operation and for the business to operate. That would be my definition of identity and access management. Heather, did I miss anything?
So many possibilities for identity and how people interpret it. It's like art.
It really is. But for lots of you, of course, you have very specific communities that you're in charge of or worrying about. You have staff, you have students, you have alumni, you have people working through what we would call an identity life cycle, where they might, for example, apply to be faculty. They might be hired into faculty. They may leave the faculty. They may come on as a grad student. They may cease being a grad student and cycle through many other phases in the organization. So the education identity management world is not simple. So we're going to try. Yes, go ahead.
Which makes it interesting when we talk about identity. We talk about all the different personas that a person might have, the context that they might appear, and yet when you start getting into conversations, say about standards or products or everything, they talk about what the user is going to do as if there's one thing that's a user, one type of person that's a user. And yet the experience that you would expect, the access that you would expect, how you would, define what the identity is for this type of person for, say, a library walk-in, is probably a little bit different than you would define for your faculty. So we recognize this and then immediately turn around and go back to simplifying it by talking about the user. The user is one of the worst fallacies I think we keep bumping into in the identity space.
So true. All right, well, let's dive in. Prepare yourselves. Dun, dun, dun. So the way we thought we would split up this conversation, and it will be a fairly spirited conversation, is about four forces that we think are shaping identity. And so the first force is really something Heather is an expert in, which is the changing nature of the browser. So let me know when you want to change slides, Heather.
There we go. So the changing nature of the browser. This could almost be called the changing nature of privacy interactions on the web. To date, the browser, which using the terms of art in the field, the user agent has been a very passive thing. It interprets the HTML and it presents it to the user. It's not actually an active party in an authentication flow. It's not that kind of thing. But it's trying to become that kind of thing. It's trying to move from a passive pass-through, let the relying party do what it's going to do, let the user accept what it's going to accept, let the identity provider present the credentials. And now suddenly there's going to be a fourth player. And you can see this starting to happen as these tech companies, the Googles, the Apples, the Microsofts, are all saying, you know what, third-party cookies, bad, they're terrible, they're no good, because they allow for tracking of a user without the user's consent across the web. Which is true, they do, but they also enable certain aspects of authentication and authorization on the web, which are perfectly valid. There are a lot of features, low-level primitives we call them, that browsers have used to date to build sites and services that can be used for tracking or can be used for very legitimate purposes like authentication and authorization, and that the browser cannot tell the difference because from a technical perspective, there is no difference. Tracking and authentication looks the same. So yep.
We might want to just define third-party cookies here too.
Yeah, that would probably help. So what's a cookie? Well, first you get some flour, and then you get some butter, and then you get a couple of domains, right? You have a domain, and if a domain, we'll call it, just for argument's sake, Microsoft.com. If Microsoft.com writes to to the memory space of your browser something that Microsoft is going to read, that's a first-party cookie because it's one domain reading one domain's thing. A third-party cookie would be Microsoft writing something to the browser that anybody can see, that anybody can read, that any domain can look at and learn where did this user come from? Where were they previously? What did they see? What did they do? It can store different pieces of information about the user's experience or the session that the user was in or any number of different things. So that's a third-party cookie, and that's what the browser companies are saying has to go. Google is working on something called Federated Credential Management API. You might have heard of that in the past as WebID, but there was a project name collision, so they changed the name. Apple is working on something called IsLogin, though I think they've recently changed the name on that one too. There's work to be done on things called first-party sets, where they're trying to say, okay, well, if this family of domains wants to read each other's cookies, then they can do that. So that's proving to be a lot more complicated than it might sound.
So it's domain grouping, basically.
It's basically domain grouping, but we'll stop picking on Microsoft for the moment. Let's pick on Salesforce. Salesforce has 400 domains to their name. So, and lots of clients. That doesn't fit into a first party set. There's too many. So what do you do instead? We don't know yet. Next slide would be good. So this is a diagram that comes directly from the Federated Credential Management API READMEs, basically the explainers. This comes from the one about cookies. And it's that visual representation of, look, the user agent, the browser, the thing in the middle is no longer passive. It's actually trying to now hold state about sign in, sign out, you know, what the user is doing, what the relying party is asking for, who's owning the consent for all of that. And consent is, everybody wants to own consent. Absolutely everybody wants a piece of that consent pie. The relying party needs to be able to say, yes, we asked and the individual agreed to let us have information. The identity provider often wants to have a record of consent that said, we asked the individual if they were okay with us releasing information about them, and they said, all right. The user wants to have some record that says, what did I actually agree to and with whom? And now the browser itself is trying to say, well, we are also interested in holding a record of consent about what the user has agreed to. Did they know exactly what they were getting into when they decided to click on this button?
Right. And for those of you who don't know what identity providers and relying parties are, what we're really talking about is federation, which is usually a standards-based process that uses one of two protocols, either SAML or OpenID Connect. So if you want to learn more about those, you can use those two names to Google them. And the simple way that federation works is that identity providers know who the user is and are willing to vouch on behalf of the users, and relying parties want to know who the user is. So you can think of it as a secure introduction service of users between websites.
I would say it's not just federation, it's also single sign-on. I mean, single sign-on is the basis for federation. It's just a question of, are you now looking outside of an organization and how the identities are being used? See,
and I would say that federation is the basis of single sign-on rather than the other way around. See?
Which came first?
Yeah, so you can all weigh in the Q&A. I think there's a serious chicken and egg question here that must be answered.
So we put a couple links here for where some of the conversations about what's going to happen, what does the browser need to do, what technologies need to be changed, and where those conversations are being held within the W3C, one of the probably the main standards organization for the browser layer of the internet. Next slide. But wait, there's more. So we focused on third-party cookies, but that's not the only thing that the world is looking at. The question is, can this feature, this primitive, this thing, can you use it for tracking? Yes or no? If yes, then we have to figure out how to make it so you cannot. That includes third-party cookies, but it includes several other things too, including what's called link decoration, which is when you've got your typical URL, and then usually there's a question mark, and then there's stuff. It might be UTM equals something. It might be a random string. It might, it could be all sorts of things. It could be the query string because you did a search. It could be session information because you're doing an authentication flow. Or it could be tracking information to say this user came here because they clicked on the email, or they clicked on another link, or because they did something specific, and we're going to know what that is. Bounce tracking. This is a trick that folks have tried to play for a very good reason and a very bad reason. The very good reason is when a session for an authentication process is renewing itself, rather than showing that to the user, it's just going to go back and forth real quick behind the scenes. No one will ever see it. Is this session still valid? Yes or no? Great. But it's also a way for an ad tracker to have someone come to their site. Therefore, they can say, look, a user came to our site. We are now a first party in their interactions. and therefore we are good and trusted, and we can absolutely track them across the web. Bad. But that's a thing, and there are folks looking at how do we change that behavior. And IP addresses. Now, this is a particularly important one for higher education, because your libraries almost certainly, I would say with 99% probability, are using IP addresses as a way to authorize accessed content. IP addresses are a way to track a user. It's a piece of information that when you look at the consumer web is absolutely a way to say this user is going from here to here to here to here. Apple has already taken steps to say we're going to obfuscate IP addresses going forward. And this could be an interesting challenge for you. So next slide, please. Actually, no, that is this slide. So I put a link here to a browser FAQ where we put together some questions and answers as to what is all this browser stuff, what does it mean for the libraries, and what can Campus IT do about it. I strongly suggest that if you are not a librarian, share it with your campus libraries. If you're a campus librarian, share it with your IT department. It's supposed to be it's an open, free resource for anybody to be able to use and point to.
Right. Okay, so that's 1 out of 4. Let's hit number 2. So number 2 is what we're calling direct presentation of credentials. Now, this should be a fairly familiar term for a lot of you in the education world. But before we talk about what a direct presentation is, let's talk about what a federated presentation is. As you've already heard, federation is the idea of an identity provider speaking on behalf of a relying party. So this happens very frequently in the case of single sign-on, as we talked about, where you have really a home realm, right? A home authority that is going to introduce you to every single website around the internet that you are authorized to go.
I think you meant an identity provider speaking on behalf of the individual, not their relying party.
Oh yes, thank you, thank you. The identity provider speaking on behalf of the human to whom we're hoping to authorize or send to another site to do work, in fact. So this is a common pattern, right? The quality of this pattern that needs to be recognized is that the user does not have a lot of agency in this process. And that can, that has amazing qualities that are positive and amazing qualities that aren't as positive. It's fantastic if you're an employee and all you want to do is get to your data. If you just don't want to have to log in everywhere, then you bounce around, and what happens is under the covers we send SAML assertions, which are structured signed documents on your behalf. Where it's not as great is when you yourself are a consumer, when you're representing yourself. And in that case, we mostly want to have more agency for the same reason as some of the previous trend was discussing. We want to be able to control, know where our data is going, understand the consequences of our data. And so what's happening now in the industry is a rollover to come to formally embrace direct presentation. So in a direct presentation, the identity provider no longer directly talks to the relying party. The identity provider talks to some kind of software operating on behalf of the user, and then the user themselves talk to the relying party. So you can see it's an explicit relationship instead of an on behalf of relationship. Now this has lots of implications. Again, some good, some not so great. But the interesting thing right now is that we have a concept called verifiable credentials. And verifiable credentials is a general purpose model for a direct presentation, both an issuance of credentials to a user and a presentation of credentials to a relying party. So of course, when you think of this is how people use diplomas, right? You get issued a diploma when you graduate, you tuck it away in that filing cabinet, and then when you go to apply for a job, you somehow have to squirrel it back out and hope it's still there and fax it to your relying party. So verifiable credentials is exactly that model. And the difference really is now we're in a world of QR codes. So the 3 things your end users would have to know is they need to be able to get a credential from an issuer. So those credentials are still authoritative. They're still signed by the issuer. They're just being issued to a different party. And then once they have all their credentials, they have them in a wallet, the same way that you would have cards in a wallet. And at the time you choose to give that data to a relying party, it's you, the human, who has to act and press the buttons and look at the data that's going to be sent and perform some kind of action to actually send it. And so this is different, right? This is a it's a change in how we normally do online or digital identity. And where we're seeing this is in a couple of places. We are seeing it in what I would call ISO 18013, which will mean nothing to most of you, but that is the Mobile Driver's License International Standard. So we're seeing a number of pilots right now. That standard has just been ratified, and the idea of a contactless in-person presentation of your driver's license is something that's not very far away for many people, right? So, you get pulled over because you maybe went a little over the speed limit. What's going to happen? You don't have to give them your driver's license. You simply have to hold up your phone, and they have to be able to securely interact with your phone to get your mobile driver's license.
So Pam, I have a question about this one.
Yes.
One of the things that seems to be a little bit more unique in higher education than in the consumer space is very often the relying parties don't care who the user is. They care about the user's affiliation, and that's actually all they really care about. They want the assertion that this person is in fact affiliated as a student with Stanford University. And that's not something that the user owns. That's an attribute about them that's actually owned by the institution itself.
Right.
So how would this support that kind of model?
So the way that would work is that you would get get a card from your institution, and it is issued to you as the individual. But what you could do is use what's called selective disclosure to omit your actual name at the time that you present it to the drugstore, for example, to get drugs, or to your retailer to get a discount. So that selective disclosure mechanism is one of the qualities of this that's very interesting. The second quality is, of course, this correlation quality, which means you can't, your issuer, if we do it right, and when used in the right circumstances, the issuer doesn't know where the card is being presented or what data is being disclosed. So there's a huge privacy component if we get it right. Now, not all credentials need that. Sometimes these credentials need to be live checking status, communicating back and forth. But the potential is there, and that's something we're really excited about. All right, we better keep on trucking here. Let's look at the next one. All right, so the next one will be relatively quick, but we think it's a pretty important one. And that is that the governance and security functions in a lot of enterprises and organizations is both changing and converging to merge with each other. Here's what I mean about that. When you look at today in the identity management world, when we talk about governance, we talk about some pretty basic things, right? We talk about understanding which users belong to which applications. We talk about the lifecycle management of being able to be sure that if a user is terminated, they get pulled out of all the applications where they are sitting so that they're not, there's no security risk there. We also talk about, things that historically have been extremely manual, like access certifications. And by access certifications, if you're not familiar with it, you can think of it as essentially having to sign an attestation at the end of the quarter to say, only the correct 10 people had access to this accounting application. We can kind of thank Enron for that. I think that, Enron pretty well caused Sarbanes-Oxley, and Sarbanes-Oxley has been one of the big regulatory trendsetters, shall we say, for the last number of decades. And then access reviews, of course, is the idea of looking over what access people have in order to understand if it's appropriate. And now all of this is, in some sense, accounting, right? It's bookkeeping. It's getting to know how the world works, but it doesn't. There's no urgency here. There's no other than making sure users are removed from the applications, even there, for the most part, if you don't get removed immediately because your access control, because your federation server is central, it's unlikely to vouch for the user, and therefore you don't really have a security issue in deprovisioning users. But wait, everything is changing. So that that governance world is really called IGA most commonly. There's a whole nother world which is about, can administrators access privileged applications, and that's called privileged application management. Generally speaking, the idea behind PAM, get it, is the idea, elevation of privileges, right? So you want people to have least standing privilege, meaning that they should be able to do very little at the beginning and they can always ask for what they need in order to get their jobs done. So PAM has always been about this idea of stepping people up, getting them the administrator password, but doing so in a really, with a lot of oversight. Then the third piece is called KEAM, and this is really new. CIEM, this is Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. And this is about resources. It's about understanding your resources across your entire multi-cloud world. Well, here's what's happening. All of these things are starting to smush together. And so privileged access management now has to happen across all of your multi-cloud. It also has to happen for all of your identities, no longer just for users. And so a lot of these practices that used to exist about user lifecycle management, well, they have to apply everything. They have to apply to machines, they have to apply to software, right? Everything needs oversight today. And then the third piece is really this idea that now it actually matters how soon you do it. So you want to be able to elevate privilege, get your job done, and remove the privilege immediately. But more importantly, you need to know immediately if abuse is happening, because that's the remediation you have to have happen from a security perspective. So it's no longer a case where, at the end of the quarter, you can get together and say, oh, gosh, Sally had access to the, to the accounting app, and where's that $50,000 we were missing? It doesn't work that way anymore. You have to be able to do it super strong and in time. And what this really heralds is the fact that this is now a security play. We can't be secure anymore without being able to detect anomalies, and governance is the way that anomaly detection is being signaled, right? And of course, it's only one of a number of signals. There are other signals, coming from operating systems and coming from various other signal emitters, but governance is now huge. So, things are changing. Now, here's the really interesting thing about this. It is a framework. If you think of what your day-to-day governance is, you are figuring out who trusts what are the rules, what are the policies, under what circumstances should those things happen? Because now you're trying not only to know what should happen, but also what shouldn't. So this is pushing us into, dare I say, the land of zero trust, where we're assuming breach, right? And we're always striving for least privilege. And so you can see how governance is just starting to slot right into that zero trust philosophy of being vigilant and constantly watching.
Yeah, I think campuses don't have a choice here in terms of being prepared to move, because if the last 20 months have taught us nothing, it's that you can't assume people are going to be on campus. In this case, we went extreme because now nobody was on campus, but that means a lot of the campus firewall support, a lot of that kind of direction of we'll secure it by making the campus an island is no longer viable.
Right. And now the other interesting thing about this, when you think about this as a framework, you think about it as the rules and policies and laws of the land. These are technical at the bottom and they're legal at the top, and there's often a gap between those two things, right? The legal and the technical rarely meet. But as we get smarter about this, and as we're watching more, and as those patterns become more and more conventionalized, we start to have options towards merging the legal, the regulatory, and the technical world. And that I do believe is where we're going. I will say that also works for verifiable credentials. You have to know in what the rules are for presenting your credentials. right? You know you can't present somebody else's diploma when you apply for a job, right? That's a rule. It's pretty well unspoken, and yet people figure it out. Those types of rules, when can you use a credential? Under what circumstances? With what consequences, right? What happens if you commit fraud? Who enforces things if you commit fraud? All of this stuff is stuff that's starting to gel, and we're trying to find ways to, to encode it so that it can be used reliably across many, many domains. All right, we're getting close to the end here. The last, but definitely not least, force that we're seeing right now is absolutely the security and attack surface that's going on in 2021. We cannot express how very stressful it is to try to operate identity systems in these modern times. I hope you would all, that obviously includes all of you, and us. We are working very, very hard to try to make sure that we can operate our systems safely. So let's talk about some very specific identity-related security issues. This link here, aka.ms/Solorigate Identity IOCs, what that is a link to a set of indicators of compromise. And an indicator of compromise is what they would call a TTP, a tactic, technique, or procedure that is observed by an attacker during an attack. And so these indicators of compromise are our best chance of recognizing when an attack is in play. And what we discovered in December approximately of 2020 was that attacks were ongoing, and that we were able to actually find some of these tells, if you will. And so this link is somewhat old, but really, really relevant right now if you don't know what kind of identity attacks are going on. So Solorigate was an attack by, actually, I think we call the actor Nobelium now. So this was a nation state attack, very, very sophisticated, but specifically there were identity attacks. And if you're the identity specialists here watching this, these are the 4 things that blew our minds that we want to make sure you know about and you are aware of. And it doesn't matter what product you use, it doesn't matter what kind of setup you have. These are attacks that may be viable for you. So let's just go very quickly through them. So the first one is forged SAML tokens using stolen token signing material. Now you may have heard of this before as something called a golden SAML attack. It turns out, however, that anything is golden if you steal the private keys. So you can call it a golden SAML attack, but essentially what it means is that you predicate your federation relationships on your ability to uniquely sign the tokens and assertions that you're issuing to other domains. And if somebody steals your private key, they can also create tokens and assertions that look just like you. So, so this is bad. In case that's not really obvious, it's bad. The funny thing is that in the last 10 years in the industry, we used to say a very specific phrase when we talked about private keys being stolen, which is it's game over. And the throwaway flippant comment was, if that happens, then you're done. You're done. Nothing else matters. And guess what? It does matter. That phrase has now, I think, been completely disrupted. You have to keep going. If your SAML IDP private keys are stolen, you have to keep going. And that's the new reality in security. The next one here is adding credentials to existing applications. So this is a very specific thing, which is you might have an application that is already credentialed. It might have a client ID and secret, which it uses to go about its business and request tokens on behalf of users. Would you notice if one day there were two client secrets, 2 IDs? Would you notice? And if your answer is yes, then good job. The next one down is illegitimate registrations of SAML trust relationships. So this is the case where you may have, within, say, Azure Active Directory, you may trust 2 different identity providers, and one might be in Warsaw, one might be in London, and they might be labeled Warsaw 01 and London 01. Would you notice if one day there was a Warsaw 02? Would you be surprised? Would you stop and say, I don't remember there being a reason to have a Warsaw 02? So these are the kinds of attacks that we're seeing here, where attackers are very quietly going in and making very small modifications that give them quite a lot of ability to do scary things. The last one is adding privilege to existing applications. So imagine the case you have a test application on the network, and that test application has very few permissions, and then one day it can create federation trust relationships. Will you notice that that application has suddenly been granted additional, really quite heavy permissions? Anything you want to add about this from the education perspective, Heather?
One of the biggest, that monitoring this kind of thing, I mean, it should be obvious, but let's just be explicit, it has to be automated. Because most of the identity systems, whether you're running your Microsoft environment, whether you're running a Shibboleth environment, whatever environment you're running, you've probably set it, and then you don't look at it again for a year, which means every time your staff looks at this, it's new. If you've documented it super well, then I'm willing to bet a whole $1 that you're going to have a conversation of, where did we document that? Where was it documented? What did we do? How did that work? This stuff has to be automated, and it has to reach out and talk to you. And then you know, it's almost a turtles all the way down kind of problem, because you also have something that's looking at what's talking to you to make sure it isn't compromised too, and that it isn't hiding information from you.
Yes. So the thing about this from an Azure AD perspective, so this is the one Microsoft piece of content you'll generally find in here, and that is, if you are a customer of Azure Active Directory, we have created a report called the Sensitive Operations Report. And you can see there's a link down here, aka.ms/sensitive operations report. There's a video in there that'll give you an idea of what that report can do. I strongly recommend that, you know, everyone who's an Azure AD customer, take a look at it, watch it. All of you need to be part of this process. So we can't necessarily, as Microsoft, tell that you really didn't want Warsaw 02 to be a trust federation. We need your help. We need your contextual help. So, you know, it needs to be a collaboration. We need to source these changes to you so that you see them, and you need to be able to tell us which ones are acceptable and which ones are not. All right. Heather, do you want to speak to this one?
Yes. So I hope that as you're looking at these slides, if you're thinking about the future of identity, that you're not thinking of your campus as small and irrelevant and, you know, it's not that big a deal. It is that big a deal. Now more than ever, the higher education space is measurably under threat. If you look at the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, the most targeted sectors, 3% is education. Sure seems small. That's more than energy, health, and media combined. It's what's happening is that attackers are actually trying to get into your campus infrastructure because they want access to the research that your research faculty are doing right now. Or they want to actually insert data into what your research faculty are researching right now. This is, the FBI has reached out to campuses all across the country in the last year saying, we're seeing this being a very, very big deal where attackers both inside the country and outside the country are trying to damage our research infrastructure, which is you. So the importance of making sure that you know what's going on and that you are a part of helping make this harder for attackers can't be overstated.
Yep. All right. We're getting to the end of our time. You know, I want to make sure we're leaving time for questions. So just some quick advice here. You know, if you want to understand how to stick it to attackers, it doesn't have to be hard. You may have security departments, but identity has a job. They have a place here. So the number one thing you can do is take away password guessing attacks like password spray. And you can do this really simply. There's tons of products on the market, products that will make sure that users cannot set a password in the first place that's obviously guessable, like password 123. And the other one is tools that allow you to check whether a password has already been breached. If you just do those two things, you're already way, way ahead of the game. The next one down is to take away phishing attacks, and the easiest way to do that is multi-factor authentication. So that one is pretty well a given. You can eliminate 98% of the risk surface, so simply by going to MFA, and you can do even better if you want to try to use really phishing resistant stuff like security keys in the FIDO world or some of these other fancy authentication methods. The last one I'm not going to talk to too much, but it's a watch this space kind of thing. We're focusing now on what we call token theft. This is the idea that the legitimate user authenticates, gets their life together, and then we issue a token that somebody else steals. So that one, just stay tuned for that. We think that's a rising risk, but right now it's so easy to steal a password that attackers just don't have to work that hard. Token theft is hard, stealing passwords is easy. All right, so we're into our recommendation time. You want to go with this one?
Yes, because I'm going to use and abuse my 22 years of working in the higher ed space to say something really blunt. In all the institutions that I've worked for and with, Central IT has regularly been given the instruction of absolutely, we need to educate our students. They need to have training. We need to make sure the staff is trained. Don't talk to the faculty. Don't send email to the faculty. Don't try and force educate the faculty. Let the faculty do whatever the faculty want to do, because we don't want to upset them. We don't want them, who knows that they are so very, very smart, feel like they are being told they don't know something. Though in every case, every major issue that I've personally been involved with at an institution involved faculty credentials. So it's possibly going to hurt. Your provost may be very unhappy, but you've got to implement the basic best practices of security, including education about passwords, not letting the faculty share the passwords with their grad students or their postdocs, implementing MFA. All these things are there. These are the best practices that have been around now for a very long time. You've got to get your faculty on board.
Right. So the next piece up is you need to use your materials. So you're not alone in this game. You are, if you are running these IAM initiatives, you need to have air cover from folks who can give you the data so that you can go get the funding you need and create the initiatives you need to be secure and safe, right? To have the tools you need. And so things like the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, that's where those graphs came from earlier. The URL is super easy. It's aka.ms MDDR, Microsoft Digital Defense Report. It is chock full of amazing factoids and amazing information that that you should be able to run up your chain. You should be able to say this is where the world is. The world is not in a place where we can ignore basic security hygiene, basic identity configuration, and governance and oversight over how our systems are running. The other piece of information that might be interesting to you, the director of identity security said to me that this is true. Apparently, education has the highest per capita rate of compromise out of any vertical. So, if anyone gives you trouble, that's the kind of data that we have. Highest per capita compromise rate is education. So for this one, I think the point is that you have to pay attention. If you think about the third-party cookie pieces, this is stuff everyone takes for granted. You assume that because your apps worked yesterday, that they're going to work tomorrow. And with all of this privacy work that's happening, it's just not necessarily the case. So you need to be aware of the dates, and you need to be part of the discussion forums if you feel like you want to have a voice. Anything you want to add, Heather?
Because you've been relying on the fact that one browser is essentially as good as the next, in terms of the functionality it's going to offer your users, and that's one of the things that's changing right this very instant. Anything that's using Safari or any browser whatsoever that's running on iOS or iPadOS, which is, I don't care if it actually has the label Chrome underneath, it's running the same stuff as Safari is. I mean, all of those things are diverging significantly from what you see in one browser to the next one. So your users, it will work just fine. You might go and test it and say, I can't replicate this problem. It's getting very, very specific to the browser, to the operating system, and that's part of why you need to just stay aware that these things will change with every update now.
Right. So if you have any questions, feel free to start putting them into the Q&A tool. We'll take a look through them from an overall standpoint. When you look at these 4 different forces, what do they mean? Well, I think they have some really interesting things in common. The first thing is that everyone wants the software to help the humans. That's something that's common across a lot of these initiatives. We want browsers to get smarter, and we want them to help users more, but we also have this concept now of wallets, and how can wallets help users? We want to help users manage consent. All of these things are very, what's the word? They're very supervisory. And yet we also want to give users more agency, more control, and more privacy. And so this combination of greater oversight for greater security, and also greater assistance for more agency and privacy. It's an interesting world.
And it's one that the higher ed is in such a solid position to take advantage of. Some of the things that we've presented today, you have experience with. You've got more experience with than just about anybody on the internet. The concept of federated credentials has been in higher ed for decades, right? You all understand that concept better than most. The concept of the comprehensive learner records, the CLRs, you know that, you do that every day. It's not so big a leap to do it with more than just those records, but to do it with more information that you all hold.
Right, and actually, now that you've said that, I think the other piece is that, wouldn't it be great if some of these things that have been initiatives that have been education-only initiatives for a long time start to merge with the mainstream, where instead of having to do bespoke education-specific work, there's a model that can be conventionalized, that can be rubber stamped, so that education frameworks become just another framework in a set of, sort of trust and legal and regulatory frameworks that can be, technologically filled out, technologically watched, and technologically adhered to. Wouldn't that be great?
Maybe someday.
Someday.
Hopefully someday soon.
All right, we have a couple of comments, but not too many questions. We do have 5 minutes, so you still have an opportunity. Oh, here we go. I feel like this is like a radio show. The lines are open.
The lines are open.
Let's see.
So I guess it might be worth noting, just like a radio show, we have a basically a 20-second delay on what we say and when you hear it.
Yeah, and I do apologize as well. Somehow or another, the Q&A got closed. I don't know why.
Oh.
It is open now. And to Sean, yes, presentation will be made available. Or I should ask you ladies, you're going to make the presentation available to me and I can make it available to them, correct?
Yes, absolutely. All right, well then we may not have that many questions. I guess people have to think on their feet here.
And to note, I also put an email address in the chat earlier, so there is an email address for follow-up. If you do have any questions, there is a couple questions right now in the chat.
There are.
Yes. Oh, actually, somebody's publishing them.
Beautiful.
Because I don't see them.
There you go. You should see them now.
All right, well, let's start with Jake and then we'll move back up. I think there was one just before that. So this comment says, thank you so much for discussing the challenge of engaging faculty. Just the mention allows me to approach our leadership with confidence, knowing others have the same battle. Anything you want to say, Heather?
They do so much. So one of my hats is as vice chair of the INCOM and Technical Advisory Committee. So I get to talk to a lot of campus IT reps. And as soon as you mention faculty, you just see the twitches start, because everybody has the same problem of very smart people feeling that they are entirely too smart to be educated about this kind of thing, that it shouldn't matter to them because they want to be doing their research, their science, their teaching. That's their priority, not this IT stuff. And, you know, bless their hearts, they're going to have to, if they want their, you know, if we have to put a carrot and stick in front of it, then if you want to protect your research, if you don't want to have to retract your research upon publication because ultimately you found that bad data was entered into your data sets, you have to learn this stuff. There's no choice anymore.
I would agree. Right, so the next one says, any plans to improve consent flows for SAML relying parties in Azure AD? Currently, as far as we know, there is nothing. Every SAML RP is essentially admin consent, just like ADFS. So I'm not aware of consent flow changes for SAML. That is one, though, that I can follow up on. So that, in fact, might be one that would work for the next session as well. So I can't necessarily speak to plans there for consent flows. I do think that, you know, for most enterprises, and, you know, that may or may not count for you, consent tends to be pre-given or given in batch flow. You're talking about admin consent here. For those who don't know what admin consent is in fact for the OAuth world, where an admin can, you know, instead of having pre-authorized consent the first time a user tries to use a given OAuth app, a workflow goes through to the admin that says, do you want to consent for the entire populace or not? So that's a really good question. I will pass it on and we'll see if we can get an answer back. You know, do we have a way to get back, Steve?
Yeah, you can actually respond to me and we can either post to the listserv and get it answered there, or if we know who the person was and they want to send an email to the email address, we can reply directly to them.
Okay, I think that's it for our Q&A and our time. So
there is one more, but I don't know if it was a complete question. Thoughts, experiences on HIAD self, and they must have hit enter and that was the end of it. So Richard, please fill out the send an email to the follow-up email address and we will be sure to get back to you. Pamela, Heather, thank you very much for your time, for your awesome presentation, and on that note I am going to end the session.
all right, thanks everybody.
Thank you all. Please fill out